I would like here to suggest that there are 4 ways of approaching these principal metaphysical questions. When I say a metaphysical question, I mean questions such as, where did the universe come from? Or, is there an afterlife? Is there awakening? Is everything that can be known solely within the domain of the sense perceptions? Now, these 4 approaches are 1. The mundane approach. And so what is the mundane approach? The mundane approach is very pragmatic. It's the thought that, well, what difference does it make where the universe came from? We're here anyway, aren't we? And moreover, we need to eat to live. I've got a family to feed, and so I'd better get on with it. Now, it's not as if we can abandon the worldly approach, because we all exist within the mundane world. Now, the second approach is the scientific approach, and this is what most people have faith in these days. The idea is that by investigating external material objects, we will come to understand the entire nature of the universe. This is a very slow process, and it seems the more we investigate, the more questions arise. The third approach is the philosophical approach. Now, philosophers don't have much faith in outer material objects. They are more concerned with whether or not something is logical. And so, this method principally involves ideas and concepts. The fourth approach is that of the religious individual. And when I say a religious individual, I mean somebody who has faith in doctrine and in God. When these principal metaphysical questions arise, then they look to Scripture. They have faith in doctrine. So here my question is, where does Buddhism fit into this scheme? And when I say Buddhism, really I mean this direct path to investigating the nature of phenomena. Well, it's my position that Buddhism does not fit into any of these 4 models neatly. Buddhism itself is very pragmatic. The first principle that the Buddha stated was no suffering. And this is all about the mundane world. To know suffering, and we have to identify the source of suffering. And by identifying that, we know how to proceed towards enlightenment. In general, when I say to people that I am a Buddhist, then they think that this is a non-scientific approach. But as the Buddha taught, do not accept what I say out of mere respect, but analyze it the way a goldsmith would analyze gold to see if it's authentic, by cutting, rubbing, and burning it. And so one could say that Buddhism is the original scientific methodology. The difference is that Buddhism does not put all its faith in external objects. However, it primarily concerns itself with the subjective awareness. Now, one could say that Buddhism is a form of philosophy. It's called the philosophy of mind. Especially in the Gelugpa tradition, they spend a lot of time debating philosophical arguments. But the approach of Buddhism is not a purely philosophical approach. Buddhism merely uses these logical arguments in order to draw oneself closer to ultimate realization of the truth. But this realization of the truth is something that happens in subjective awareness. Now, on the outside, Buddhism, and when I say Buddhism, I mean Tibetan Buddhism, appears to be very much like a theistic religion. And this is principally regarding the Vajrayana approach. The Vajrayana vehicle is merely a codification of the highest philosophical tenet of the Buddhist philosophy. And so these are mere symbols or representations. Although one is taught to pray with devotion to the deities, these deities are not seen to be ultimately real objects, permanent entities that are the creators of the universe. They are mere representations or reminders of the philosophical position of the highest Yoga Tantra. If we look at it clearly, then Buddhism uses each of these different methodologies in order to come to realize the ultimate truth. Buddhism is very pragmatic. In the first turning of the wheel, the first thing that the Buddha taught was no suffering. This is the beginning of the Buddhist path. And so this is a very pragmatic and mundane approach. First, we identify that things are not satisfactory, and then try to find out why it is the case. The problem is that the worldly approach tends to identify unsatisfactoriness with material goods. And so the worldly primarily apply themselves to the acquisition of material things. But the problem is, the acquisition of material things does not lead to ultimate happiness. In fact, one could say that we become spoiled by our luxury. Also, Buddhism relies heavily on direct investigation. The difference here with science is that Buddhism does not place all its faith in material outer objects. Rather, we look towards subjective consciousness and use that as our laboratory for investigation. And as I said, the Buddhist approach utilizes philosophical arguments and logical reasoning. But this logical reasoning is likened to a boat. Once one reaches the other shore, one no longer needs this boat. And these are mere techniques to draw one's understanding closer to the ultimate truth. And although Buddhism is not a theistic religion, we do see faith to be incredibly important. And also, blind faith is important. In Buddhism, this is called ignorant faith. Now, why on earth would we need blind faith? Well, to start off with, we have to have some kind of idea of what our goal is. We have to believe in something. I've said many times that nihilists have a big problem, because people who do not believe in anything, in the end, are in a much worse position than those who have faith in God. To start off with, we need to have this basic belief that there is something better than this, that there is something to work towards. Christians believe that they are working towards gaining entrance into heaven, and Hindus believe that they are working towards the reunification of their soul with the soul of God. So in Buddhism, initially, we have this blind faith in something called awakening. And why is that blind faith? Well, it's because awakening is something that is totally inconceivable to our minds. It is taught that ordinary beings cannot realize the ultimate truth, and they have to rely on the relative in order to get them there, as was taught by the noble Nagarjuna. Without the conventional, there is no understanding of the ultimate. Without realization of the ultimate, there is no liberation from samsara. So in fact, this idea of emancipation or liberation from samsara is itself an article of blind faith. And although, on the initial stages, it is important to have this blind faith, because without that there would be no motivation to progress on the path, in the end this has to be abandoned as well. And this has to be abandoned in favor of direct spiritual knowledge. When I say direct spiritual knowledge, then really the term spiritual doesn't need to be included. What we're looking for is direct knowledge. And the position of the Buddhist tenet is that there is no direct knowledge that lies outside of the subjective consciousness or subjective awareness. Now, scientists would dispute this claim and say that there are things that exist outside of the subjective consciousness. For example, one could imagine that there is a rock floating in empty space that no one has ever encountered. But this idea of a rock floating in space that no one has ever encountered is just a notion or something that arises to mind. So this itself is the topic of a future video, and I won't go into it here. But I just thought I'd share some ideas about the different approaches to answering these principal metaphysical questions. And until next time, see you later.